Hey guys, welcome back to another video. My name is Stephen, aka the Irish Whiskey Nerd, and for today's video I'm going to be talking about the 4 main Irish whiskey categories. Irish whiskey, unlike Scottish whiskey, is not characterised by geographical location. Scottish whiskies are often grouped into where they come from in Scotland. For example, Highland whiskies come from the Highland Whiskey region, Speyside whiskies come from the Speyside Whiskey region, etc, etc. In Ireland, we only characterise whiskey by the main whiskey types, which are single malt, single pot still, blended whiskey, and single grain. For this video, I'm only going to be looking at single malts, which is arguably Ireland's first ever whiskey type. The word single just means that the distillate or spirit was made in one single distillery. Each distillery has a similar process, but they do also have their own little individual marks that reflect in their whiskies. The word malt just means that it was made from 100% malted barley. While we call this whiskey type single malt nowadays, it wasn't always known as a single malt. In fact, the first written evidence of whiskey in Ireland comes from the 1405 Annals of Clonmacnoise, in which it describes a chieftain dying from taking a swig of aquavitae. Now it has to be said that whiskey back in those days was nothing like what we drink nowadays, but we can assume that it was made with malted barley and that it was very similar in some way to a single malt. And the reason why we can assume that it was made from malted barley comes from the first written evidence of whiskey in Scotland, which comes from the 1492 Exchequer Rolls, in which it describes a monk called John Core coming from the Lindore Abbey being ordered to make 8 boils of aquavitae for the king. 8 boils at that time was an early Scottish measure for malt. And given that whiskey making was said to have been brought to Scotland from Ireland, we can assume that the Irish were probably using malted barley to make whiskey as well. It also has to be noted that during that time period they were not using barrels to age whiskey like we do nowadays. The term single malt was created in Scotland, as it's believed that the Glenfiddich distillery was the first whiskey brand to advertise its whiskey as single malt in 1963. It wasn't until 2014 when Irish whiskey was protected under the European Union's geographical indication that single malt was legally recognised as one of the main Irish whiskey categories. Before the term single malt, old malt whiskey or pure malt whiskey were the most common terms to refer to this whiskey type. Bushmills was likely the first Irish whiskey to commercially market itself as single malt in the 1980s. It was likely that many Irish distilleries were making single malts prior to the 1980s, but they just were not marketing themselves as single malt. The legal definition for an Irish single malt is that it has to be made from 100% malted barley and distilled in pot stills at a single distillery. Although most Irish whiskies are triple distilled, there is no legal definition that says a single malt has to be triple distilled, and in fact, Tyrconnell, which is one of Ireland's most famous single malts, is only double distilled. Irish single malts generally have a sweeter, fruitier profile, things like apples, pears, and berries. They are also considered oily whiskies, as they tend to give you an oily coating on your palate when you drink them. They are sometimes nicknamed the Christmas whiskey, as they tend to have a similarity to mulled wine. fruity with a sweet, spicy finish. They are also extremely versatile in terms of maturation, working really well in the classic barrels like sherry casks, but also working very well in more exotic ones like tequila casks. Since the 1980s, the Irish single malt category has been dominated by two main distilleries. The Bushmills Distillery in County Antrim in Northern Ireland and the Cooley Distillery in County Louth. The Bushmills Distillery produces a light, triple distilled single malt with strong fruity flavours, while the Cooley Distillery produces bold, often double distilled single malts that are sometimes peated. Other newer distilleries that are breaking out into the Irish single malt category are the Dingle Distillery in County Kerry, the Teeling Distillery in County Dublin, and pretty much every Irish whisky distillery throughout the country. There you have it, the Irish single malt. In the next Irish whisky category video, we're going to be taking a look at the Irish single pot still, which is arguably Ireland's most quintessential whisky type. But in the meantime, make sure you like this video, share it, subscribe, and stay tuned for more whisky content. Until next time, Sláinte.